When you imagine the vast expanse of the Forbidden City, it is easy to picture its grandeur, the sweeping roofs of yellow-glazed tiles, the broad courtyards filled with ordered stone, the enormous gates painted in imperial red. What is less obvious, and yet just as important, is the way people moved across this immense stage. Every official, every servant, every noblewoman, and even the emperor himself crossed these courtyards and chambers, not with the sound of heavy boots, but with the muted shuffle of silk slippers. The slipper, simple in form yet refined in design, was more than a garment of comfort. In the Qing court, it was a signal of identity, status, and etiquette. Its construction, its materials, and even the way it was worn reflected not only the hierarchy of the dynasty, but also its obsession with regulation and silence. Within walls where words were chosen with care and gestures carried weight, footsteps, too, were expected to remain unobtrusive. To walk in silk slippers was to contribute to the quiet atmosphere of controlled order. Imagine, for a moment, the rhythm of a morning in the palace. As the sun rose over the eastern gates, servants would sweep the courtyards. Eunuchs would prepare for the emperor's early audiences, and high-ranking officials would make their way into the audience halls. The clatter of leather-soled boots, common outside the palace walls, would have seemed almost vulgar in this world. Instead, there was a soft brush of fabric against polished stone, the nearly imperceptible sound of movement contained. 1,000 small steps, each one dulled by silk, created a collective quiet that matched the solemn dignity of imperial ritual. The making of a court slipper was not an accidental craft, but a highly regulated art. Slippers were often made from silk, satin, their soles padded with layers of cotton or felt to ensure softness and silence. Some were embroidered with patterns symbolizing longevity, prosperity, or imperial authority. For higher ranks, the soles could be reinforced with fine hemp thread, though never so much as to produce an audible strike on the stone floor's colors. Colors, too, carried meaning. Yellow, reserved for the emperor, extended even to his footwear. Princes and nobles might wear blues and purples, while officials were assigned colors that matched their court robes. Servants, on the other hand, wore plain black or dark blue, the absence of ornament underscoring their position in the hierarchy. The embroiderers, usually women from skilled families or selected workshops, spent days on a single pair. Tiny needlework created motifs of dragons, phoenixes, or clouds. While to the casual eye these designs might have seemed decorative, each one held symbolic meaning that reinforced the legitimacy of rule. Even when hidden beneath a long robe, the slipper carried an invisible power, shaping the wearer's identity step by step. How one moved in slippers was as important as the slippers themselves. Court etiquette dictated not only when to bow, kneel, or stand, but also how to walk. Feet were to glide, not stomp. The heel was to be placed with control, the body kept upright, and the sound kept minimal. Eunuchs trained new attendants in the correct posture, correcting the rhythm of their gait until it matched the expectations of decorum. This silent movement had both practical and symbolic value. On a practical level, it preserved the hushed environment of the court, allowing rituals and ceremonies to proceed without distraction. Symbolically, it reinforced the Confucian principle of restraint. A person who moved quietly demonstrated discipline, self-control, and respect for order. The slipper, in its softness, became a tool of governance, ensuring that even the act of walking reflected imperial authority. The emperor himself set the standard. Accounts describe his preference for slippers of fine yellow silk embroidered with 5 clawed dragons. They were light, soft, and easy to wear during the long hours of audiences, inspections, and rituals. He was rarely seen in boots unless leaving the palace for hunting or military affairs. In the Forbidden City, the emperor was the still point at the center of the empire, and his steps, cushioned and muted, embodied that calm centrality. Yet even here, hierarchy was evident. When the emperor moved, attendants followed at a prescribed distance, their slippers marking their presence but never intruding on his. The soft sound of many feet followed one stronger, quieter pair, like the faint echo of authority rippling outward. For eunuchs and servants, slippers were a daily uniform. Unlike the embroidered footwear of nobles, theirs were simple, often made from cheaper silks or cotton. Still, they were expected to keep them in pristine condition. A frayed slipper could be grounds for reprimand, as it suggested carelessness. The eunuchs, whose lives were bound entirely to the service of the court, spent much of their time hurrying quietly across the palace. They carried messages, prepared chambers, and guided visitors. Their slippers wore down quickly, needing frequent replacement. Workshop records show that thousands of pairs were produced each year just to keep up with palace needs. Some eunuchs, especially those who gained influence, commissioned slippers with discreet embroidery, a flower, a cloud, a subtle wave of pattern. Though small, these choices signaled individuality in a life otherwise stripped of personal expression. The quiet created by slippers was not only peaceful but also tense. In the vast halls of the palace, silence amplified every gesture and glance. The shuffle of silk on stone became the backdrop to whispered intrigues, unspoken rivalries, and unending protocol. The slipper was both comfort and constraint, allowing one to move freely, yet reminding one of the limits of that freedom. Consider the morning court assembly. Dozens of officials lined up in silence, their robes brushing the ground, their slippers keeping their steps subdued. They waited for the emperor, their feet planted firmly, yet lightly, as though afraid of disturbing the air. The ceremony unfolded, not in noise, but in restraint, and always beneath the weight of words and gestures, there was the constant presence of soft, controlled steps. Today, few of these slippers survive. Those preserved in museums show delicate embroidery, faded colors, and soles worn thin from countless steps across marble and tile. Yet their survival is more than material. They remain in the written records of palace life, in inventories of supplies, in accounts of rituals, in the quiet descriptions of etiquette manuals. These documents reveal just how central such an ordinary object was in the maintenance of imperial order. For a modern reader, the slipper might seem insignificant compared to the empire's politics, wars, or reforms. But for those who lived within the Forbidden City, the slipper was a daily reality, an object that carried rules, comfort, and meaning. It was not just footwear, it was the texture of life itself. And yet, one must wonder, beyond the silence they created, what stories did these slippers carry with them? Whose steps, muffled and forgotten, once crossed those polished stones, leaving no trace but a fading thread. If you were to step into the ceremonial halls of the Qing court, you would notice immediately how little was left to chance. Every gesture, every word, and every movement had its assigned place. The slipper, so unassuming in form, played a quiet but essential role in this choreography of empire. It was not simply a shoe, it was a signal of obedience to ritual, a marker of identity in a hierarchy where even the smallest details held immense meaning. Ritual in the Qing court extended far beyond festivals or grand ceremonies. It encompassed the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Walking, kneeling, standing each had prescribed forms, and each required the proper footwear. Slippers ensured that the act of movement aligned with the larger values of the dynasty: restraint, harmony, and order. Take, for instance, the audience ceremonies. Officials entering the Hall of Supreme Harmony did so in lines, their steps slow, their bodies upright, their slippers brushing lightly against the polished floor. No clatter of boots was permitted. The silence of the slippers reinforced the solemnity of the ritual. It reminded every participant that they were part of something greater than themselves, a living performance of imperial authority. Even in rituals of lesser scale, such as offering incense or presenting reports, slippers mattered. A slipper that slipped off, a sole that scraped too loudly, or embroidery out of place could be interpreted as disrespect. Court records mention punishments for attendants whose footwear was deemed inappropriate for the occasion. What seems, to us, like a trivial detail carried real consequences in the world of imperial etiquette. The world of slippers in the Qing court was not uniform. It differed significantly between men and women. While male officials wore plain slippers matched to their robes, women's slippers were more varied and at times more constrained by fashion. For imperial consorts and court ladies, slippers were not merely functional. They were objects of display, often embroidered with intricate flowers, butterflies, or auspicious symbols. The craftsmanship demonstrated not only the wearer's refinement, but also her access to resources and artisans. A lady's slipper was an extension of her person, a visible indicator of her standing in the inner court. But here, too, silence ruled. Women were expected to move softly, their slippers muffling each step as they traversed the long corridors of the palaces. The soundlessness symbolized feminine modesty, the ideal of yin restraint balancing the yang authority of the emperor. A woman who walked too heavily risked being seen as inelegant, even unfeminine. At the same time, slippers intersected with the controversial practice of foot binding. While Manchu women, by law, were forbidden from binding their feet, Han women in the court often arrived with bound feet hidden within their slippers. This difference became a marker of ethnic identity within the palace. The unbound slippers of Manchu consorts emphasized their distinctiveness, a reminder of Qing rule over a largely Han population. Slippers, then, became not only symbols of gender but also of ethnicity and power. Every object in the Qing court had a political dimension, and slippers were no exception. Their silence was not simply a matter of etiquette, but of control. The muffled step reinforced the emperor's dominance, ensuring that no one else's presence could compete with his. Consider the audience chamber once more. Officials stood in silence, their feet planted in slippers, waiting for the emperor's entrance. The absence of noise emphasized his arrival. The slipper became part of the political stagecraft, making the emperor's movements the only ones that truly mattered. Even beyond ritual, slippers carried political weight in subtler ways. Eunuchs, who gained influence, often distinguished themselves through small details of dress. A more finely embroidered slipper could signal their proximity to power. Conversely, a servant in worn slippers could be read as neglected or disgraced. In a world where ambition was dangerous and status precarious, even footwear had to be managed carefully. It is easy to imagine slippers only in terms of those who wore them. Yet behind every pair lay the labor of countless others. Workshops within and outside the palace produced thousands of pairs each year. Records from the Imperial Household Department describe deliveries of silk, cotton, hemp, and thread to specialized artisans. These artisans lived lives far removed from the grandeur of the Forbidden City. For them, slippers were not symbols of power, but sources of livelihood. Long hours spent over embroidery frames, the strain of stitching fine silk, and the monotony of producing pair after pair, these were the realities of the craft. The beauty of a slipper in the palace masked the hardship of its creation. For the palace itself, the management of slippers was a logistical challenge. Slippers had to be distributed according to rank, inspected for quality, and replaced when worn. Attendants responsible for this work kept detailed inventories, ensuring that no official lacked appropriate footwear. In this way, the administration of slippers became another piece of the bureaucratic machinery that kept the dynasty running. Beyond ritual and politics, slippers also reveal the texture of daily life. An official who wore them for hours in court, a consort who adjusted hers while sitting in her chamber, a servant who slipped his off quietly while resting in a corner. Each of these small moments tells us something about the human side of the Qing court. For the emperor, a slipper might be a small comfort during the endless demands of governance. For a concubine, it might be a chance to express individuality through embroidery. For a servant, it might be a reminder of duty, a uniform that bound him to a life of service. Slippers absorbed the routines of daily existence, carrying not only the weight of bodies, but also the weight of expectations. They wore down slowly, the fabric fraying, the soles thinning, until they were replaced. In their quiet decay, they reflected the rhythms of court life itself, constant, repetitive, yet bound by rules that shaped even the smallest detail. Silence is not always passive. In the court, it could be a weapon, a slippered step withheld, a deliberate pause in movement, or a refusal to advance could all carry meaning. For example, officials sometimes used the choreography of their steps to signal dissent without words. Standing too long before moving, or moving too slowly, could hint at reluctance, though always at the risk of punishment. Even in the women's quarters, silence had power. A consort might retreat quietly, her steps soft but loaded with meaning. The absence of noise could signal disfavor, withdrawal, or protest in a space where direct speech was dangerous. Slippers thus became instruments of subtle communication, their silence as expressive as sound. We cannot hear the footsteps of the Qing court today. The marble halls of the Forbidden City are now walked by tourists in sneakers and sandals. There, sounds unregulated and unobserved. Yet, if you listen closely, You can imagine the muted rhythm that once filled these spaces. The slipper was an archive of movement, preserving within its threads the echoes of those who wore it. But this archive is incomplete. Most slippers wore out and disappeared. Those that remain are only fragments, preserved in museums or storage rooms. They cannot tell us the full story of the lives that animated them. What secrets were carried in those silent steps? What ambitions, fears, or hopes were hidden in the shuffle of silk? The Qing Dynasty, once powerful and secure, faced mounting challenges, foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and the pressures of modernization. The soft shuffle of slippers, once the unquestioned sound of order, began to seem strangely outdated in a world of clattering boots, iron rails, and cannon fire. Yet inside the palace walls, the rituals persisted. Officials still lined up still acted as though the world beyond the red walls did not exist. The slippers themselves, however, tell us of a dynasty at once clinging to tradition and struggling against time. They were still produced in thousands, still embroidered with dragons and clouds, still distributed according to rank. But their quiet was increasingly out of step with a world that was growing louder, faster, and more insistent. In the final decades of Qing rule, court ritual continued as though nothing had changed, yet there were cracks in the facade. Western visitors invited into the palace for diplomatic meetings often remarked on the silence of movement. To their ears, accustomed to the clatter of boots on wooden floors, the slippered shuffle seemed eerie, even unsettling. What had once symbolized dignity and restraint now struck some as antiquated. Within the court itself, younger officials and reform-minded nobles began to question the rigidity of such customs. Why should the empire spend so much time and labor? But the answer for the conservative guardians of tradition was clear. Slippers were not merely footwear. They were the fabric of order, the assurance that even in a crumbling world, the emperor's court still embodied harmony. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, the silence of slippers gave way to the noise of revolution. Soldiers in heavy boots marched through the streets of Beijing, their steps loud and forceful, symbols of a new order. The palace, once so carefully orchestrated in silence, now echoed with the sounds of a changing world. Yet, even after the abdication of the last Emperor Pui, the Forbidden City remained his home for over a decade. Within its walls, rituals persisted in miniature. PQD continued to wear yellow slippers, continued to expect his eunuchs to shuffle. In silence, continued to walk through halls as though he were still the son of heaven. In this twilight of Qing rule, the slipper took on a poignant symbolism. It no longer signified the strength of a dynasty, but its fragility. The silence it created was no longer one of authority, but of isolation, a quiet out of tune with the world beyond the walls. Today, only a handful of these slippers survive in museums. They are delicate things embroidered with dragons, phoenixes, or flowers, their soles worn thin from years of use. To the modern eye, they might seem like fragile curiosities, beautiful but trivial, yet each carries the weight of history. Consider a pair of yellow silk slippers preserved in Beijing. Their embroidery has faded, their soles are frayed, but they once touched the floors of the Forbidden City. They carried an emperor across marble steps, bore the weight of ritual kneeling, and whispered through ceremonies where silence itself was power. In those worn threads lies the memory of countless unseen gestures, countless quiet steps. Other pairs, simpler in design, belonged to eunuchs or servants. Their plainness speaks not of grandeur, but of labor, the long hours of carrying messages, sweeping halls, or attending to masters. These slippers, too, are part of the story. They remind us that history is not only about emperors, but about the countless ordinary feet that moved in silence through imperial spaces. Why do slippers matter? Why linger on such a detail in the story of a dynasty? The answer lies in what silence itself represented. For the Qing court, the absence of sound was not emptiness, but order. To move quietly was to demonstrate restraint, discipline, and respect. It was to embody the Confucian values that bound ruler and subject, emperor and official, man and woman. In this sense, the slipper was both practical and symbolic. It cushioned the foot, but it also cushioned the ego, reminding every wearer of their place in the hierarchy. Its silence was a constant lesson. Power is not only in words or weapons, but also in the discipline of the smallest acts. And yet, silence has its dangers. In the final years of the dynasty, the insistence on quiet became a kind of blindness. While the world outside grew louder with the sounds of modernity, the court clung to its rituals of silence. The slipper, once a symbol of harmony, became a symbol of resistance to change. Walking today through the Forbidden City, one can almost imagine the sound of slippers against the stone. The tourist's footsteps, heavy and uneven, contrast sharply with what once was. Yet, if you listen closely in the imagination, you can still hear the soft shuffle of silk, the muted rhythm of a vanished order. The slipper teaches us that history is not always in grand battles or dramatic events. It is also in the quiet textures of daily life, in the objects that shaped how people moved, thought, and behaved. In studying slippers, we glimpse the discipline of the Qing court, the artistry of its craftsmen, the modesty of its women, the obedience of its officials, and the silent struggles of its servants. And perhaps the slipper also raises a question. For us today, in our world of constant noise, what have we lost by forgetting the power of silence? If the silk slipper symbolized silence in the halls of the Qing court, the inkstone symbolized its words. While the emperor's authority was expressed in ritual and presence, it was preserved and enacted on paper. Every edict, every petition, every report, and every account began at an inkstone, where a bureaucrat ground stick ink into water until it reached the proper thickness. From there, the brush moved across paper, producing characters that carried the weight of empire. The Qing Dynasty was an empire of documents. From tax records in distant provinces to memorials submitted to the throne, paperwork was the invisible thread that held the state together. Without it, grain would not be collected, officials would not be promoted, and the emperor would not know the condition of his realm. For the men who worked within this system, the inkstone was as essential as the slipper. It was the quiet companion of their days and nights, a stone basin into which they poured their time, effort, and lives. Picture a minor official in a provincial Yamana government office, far from the majesty of Beijing. His desk is piled with paper, tax receipts, land surveys, petitions from villagers, orders from superiors. At the center sits his inkstone, worn smooth from years of grinding ink sticks. Next to it lies a brush rack with several brushes, their tips carefully shaped. A small porcelain dish holds water. His robes are modest, his room drafty, but his tools are the same as those used. In the Forbidden City itself, the day begins not with a conversation, but with the sound of grinding ink. He presses the stick against the stone, adding drops of water, slowly producing the thick black liquid that will fuel hours of writing. The motion is repetitive, even meditative. In this quiet act lies the beginning of governance. The brush. Reports must be copied in careful calligraphy, petitions answered with appropriate courtesy, records tallied with precision. Errors are dangerous. A miswritten character could alter meaning, delay decisions, or invite suspicion. Officials often copied documents several times to ensure accuracy before sending them onward. Each page was both a tool of administration and a test of discipline. The volume of paperwork in the Qing bureaucracy was staggering. Every tax payment generated receipts. Every legal case produced records. Every official wrote memorials to report on local conditions. These memorials traveled from provinces to Beijing, where clerks in the central ministries read, copied, and archived them. The emperor himself received a selection, often annotated by officials along the way. This flow of paper never ceased. In times of crisis, famine, rebellion, flooded, multiplied. Officials sometimes spent entire nights writing reports by lamplight, their brushes scratching across paper as couriers waited to carry the documents onward. The inkstone never rested. For the emperor, too, the weight of paper was immense. Qianlong, one of the most diligent emperors, is said to have reviewed thousands of documents in a single year. He read them not only to govern, but also to maintain control over his officials. A well-written memorial could earn praise. A poorly written one could earn rebuke. Thus, the bureaucrat's inkstone was not merely a tool of administration, but also a stage on which loyalty and competence were tested. Writing was not just functional, it was aesthetic. Calligraphy was considered a reflection of character. A bureaucrat who wrote with steady, balanced strokes was thought to embody discipline and moral uprightness. One whose brush wavered might be judged careless or unreliable. This link between writing and morality gave the inkstone a deeper significance. Grinding ink was not only preparation for work, but a form of moral cultivation. Officials believed that patience at the inkstone reflected patience in governance. In this sense, every document was not merely words on paper, but an extension of the bureaucrat's own virtue or lack thereof. Calligraphy manuals circulated widely, teaching the proper forms of characters and the rhythm of strokes. Young scholars, preparing for the civil service examinations, spent endless hours at their inkstones, copying texts, perfecting their brushwork. Success in these exams depended as much on writing as on knowledge. Thus, the inkstone was at the center of a scholar's life long before he became an official. Not all inkstones were alike. For ordinary clerks, a simple stone basin sufficed. But for high-ranking officials and wealthy scholars, inkstones became objects of prestige, crafted from fine stone, sometimes inlaid with jade or carved with inscriptions. These inkstones were works of art in themselves. Collecting inkstones became a passion for some, much like collecting paintings or porcelain. An elaborate inkstone on a desk could signal refinement and learning, even hint at political influence. Yet no matter how ornate, its purpose remained the same: to hold ink for the brush. In this way, the inkstone embodied the Confucian ideal of balance and object, both functional and symbolic, humble yet profound. For many officials, however, the inkstone was less a symbol of refinement than a reminder of exhaustion. The Qing bureaucracy was vast, but often understaffed. A single magistrate might govern tens of thousands of people, with only a handful of clerks to assist him. The paperwork was endless. Complaints from villagers, disputes over land, reports of floods or bandits all had to be written, copied, and archived. Officials sometimes complained of being buried in documents. Some compared their lives to their inkstones, worn down by constant grinding, their energy slowly consumed by the demands of the brush. Yet they continued, for to falter in paperwork was to falter in governance, and the consequences could be severe. Behind every document was a human story: a widow petitioning for her land rights, a farmer reporting crop failure, a soldier requesting payment. Each left traces in ink. The bureaucrat's task was to translate these voices into the formal language of government, stripping them of emotion, yet preserving their core. For the villagers, the bureaucrat's inkstone was both a barrier and a bridge. It transformed their cries into paperwork that might or might not reach the emperor's eyes. To them, the inkstone represented the distant, impersonal face of the state. Yet, without it, their voices would have vanished altogether. As the brush moved across paper, the inkstone slowly wore down. Some inkstones survived generations of use, their surfaces carved deep by decades of grinding. Others cracked or broke, discarded when no longer useful. Each bore silent witness to the bureaucrat's labor, the hidden foundation of empire. One cannot help but wonder how much of the Qing dynasty's strength and weakness lay not in its armies or palaces, but in the quiet persistence of men at their inkstones, grinding, writing, and recording without end. When we speak of Qing bureaucracy, it is tempting to imagine it as an abstract machine, cold and efficient, churning out decisions from the emperor's will. Yet the truth was far more complicated, far more human. At the center of this machine was not only the inkstone, but the document itself. Each sheet of paper, covered with brushstrokes, had a life. It was created, copied, passed from hand to hand, annotated, filed, sometimes forgotten, sometimes retrieved years later. Understanding this life cycle is to understand how the Qing state truly functioned. A document began with need: a farmer's petition, a clerk's account, a magistrate's report arose because something demanded attention. Paper in the Qing dynasty was plentiful but never wasted. The sheets used in official work were usually made of mulberry bark, bamboo, or rice straw, chosen for durability. The process began at the inkstone. The bureaucrat ground his ink, dipped his brush, and began to write in the carefully prescribed style. Every character had to be legible, every phrase in accordance with precedent. A memorial to the throne could not read like a personal letter. It had to echo the formal cadences of state. Even petitions from commoners, when accepted, were rewritten into proper bureaucratic form before being submitted upward. The state did not merely receive information, it reshaped it, translating human experience into administrative language. Once written, a document began its journey. At the local level, copies were often made, one kept in the yeoman's archive, another sent to the provincial capital. From there, if the matter was significant, it traveled to Beijing. The courier system was organized, but imperfect. Documents could take weeks or months to arrive, depending on distance and weather. Each stage of travel added marks, seals from local offices, notes in the margins from clerks, endorsements from higher officials. By the time a memorial reached the central government, it was no longer the fresh writing of a single bureaucrat. It was a palimpsest, layered with commentary, an object shaped by many hands. The life of the document was cumulative. The ultimate destination of certain documents was the emperor himself. Qing emperors, especially diligent ones, like Kanchi and Qianlong, insisted on reading a remarkable number of memorials. They did so not merely to govern, but to ensure that no official could monopolize information. An emperor's brush was different from any other. He wrote in vermilion ink, a bright red that stood out on the page. His comments, sometimes a single character, sometimes an extended note, transformed an ordinary report into an imperial command. This system, known as rescripts, gave documents their highest authority. The red brush turned paper into law. For bureaucrats, receiving a document marked with the emperor's vermilion characters was both an honor and a burden. It meant their work had reached the highest level, but it also meant scrutiny. A sharp rebuke in red could end a career. After a document had served its immediate purpose, it entered the vast world of archives. The Qing Dynasty was meticulous in record-keeping. Ministries in Beijing maintained enormous collections of documents, carefully organized by topic and date. Local governments, too, kept archives, though often under less ideal conditions. The archives were not passive. They were consulted when disputes arose, when precedent was needed, or when corruption was suspected. A land case might require reference to documents decades old. A tax investigation might uncover inconsistencies in past records. In this way, the life of a document could stretch far beyond its initial writing, reappearing years later to influence new decisions. But archiving also revealed the human limits of bureaucracy. Documents piled up in numbers too great to manage. Clerks labored endlessly to copy, file, and index them. But inevitably, some were misplaced, misfiled, or deliberately hidden. Paper could preserve truth, but it could also bury it. Where there is paperwork, there is manipulation. Qing officials sometimes altered documents to cover their tracks. A report of tax collection might be inflated, with the surplus pocketed by the magistrate. Petitions might be rewritten to downplay unrest. Memorials might be copied with subtle changes to protect allies or damage rivals. Corruption could be as simple as a bribe to a clerk who held the pen. Because so many documents passed through so many hands, opportunities for alteration abounded. Even seals could be forged. For this reason, emperors frequently ordered comparing different copies of the same report, demanding reports from multiple sources, or sending inspectors to verify information on the ground. Yet, even with vigilance, the sheer volume of documents made complete accuracy impossible. The empire relied on paper, but it was also deceived by it. The life of a document could be both revelation and disguise. One of the most exhausting tasks in the bureaucracy was copying. Few documents existed in a single version. Memorials were recopied for archives. Summaries were produced for officials, translations made for Manchu and Chinese readers alike. Clerks often spent their entire careers producing copies, their lives consumed by repetition. For these men, the inkstone was not a symbol of refinement, but a burden. Their hands cramped from writing, their eyes strained from poor light. Some complained in poems of the monotony, comparing themselves to caged birds writing characters on paper instead of flying in the sky. Yet their work was indispensable. Without copies, the system would collapse. In an age before printing presses were widely used for official business, the human brush was the empire's lifeline. Despite its flaws, paperwork gave the Qing Dynasty remarkable reach. Through documents, the emperor in Beijing could know of a flood in Jiangnan, a rebellion in Yunnan, or a harvest in Manchuria. He could respond with orders, all carried back on paper. In this way, ink and brush extended imperial authority across vast distances. But paper also gave power to those who controlled it. A skilled clerk who managed documents carefully could shape the flow of information, highlighting some reports while burying others. Eunuchs and high officials alike recognized the strategic value of paper. To control documents was to control what the emperor saw, and therefore what decisions he made. The life of a document, then, was never neutral. It was shaped by need, by distance, by copying, by commentary, by politics, by corruption, by archiving. It was fragile yet powerful, temporary yet enduring. If we trace the path of one petition, from a farmer's brush in a dusty village to an emperor's vermilion mark in Beijing, we see not only a document's life, but the life of an empire. Yet one must ask, how many voices were lost in the process? How many petitions were altered, dismissed, or buried in archives, never to be seen again? If the inkstone preserved the empire's words, what silences did it also create? The Qing dynasty ruled over one of the largest empires in history, and yet it did so not with armies alone, nor even with the visible rituals of the court, but with something far quieter: paper, the endless stream of documents, born at the inks of countless officials, was the nervous system of the state. It carried reports from distant provinces, transmitted orders from the throne, and preserved precedents in archives. Without it, the empire could not have survived. And yet, as the Qing dynasty reached its later centuries, the very abundance of paper that once gave it strength began to weigh it down. The strength of Qing bureaucracy lay in its ability to make the vast legible through documents. The emperor in Beijing could learn of the harvest in Guangdong, the tax arrears in Shaanxi, the population growth in Sichuan. Petitions, memorials, and reports turned scattered events into written form, something that could be read, categorized, and acted upon. This capacity for documentation allowed the dynasty to govern with surprising efficiency. Flood control projects were planned through careful record-keeping of river levels. Military campaigns relied on detailed logistical reports. Even in times of crisis, such as the White Lotus Rebellion or the Taiping Civil War, the empire's ability to marshal resources depended on the flow of documents. The inkstone, then, was not only the tool of a bureaucrat, but the instrument of empire. Each drop of ink was a piece of governance. Each document, however routine, was part of a system that turned human activity into state knowledge. Yet there was a cost. As the centuries wore on, the flood of documents grew overwhelming. Officials were buried in paperwork. Magistrates spent more time writing reports than solving problems. Clerks labored over endless copies. The very success of the system produced a kind of paralysis. This excess was not merely inconvenient. It shaped the way officials thought and acted. Many became more concerned with producing flawless reports than with addressing the realities on the ground. A river embankment might be collapsing, but as long as the documents described proper maintenance, an official could avoid blame. The document became an end in itself, detached from the realities it was meant to represent. The emperor, too, was caught in this web of paper. He received more documents than any one man could reasonably process. Though he prided himself on diligence, even Qian Long, at the height of his power, relied on summaries, filters, and aids. What he read was only a fraction of what was written, and what was written was already shaped by layers of bureaucracy. The life of the empire, filtered through the inkstone, was both revealed and obscured. The abundance of documents also created opportunities for corruption. Officials could hide embezzlement behind falsified reports, delay action by misfiling petitions, or exaggerate accomplishments in glowing memorials. Some bribed clerks to lose damaging documents or insert favorable annotations. In this way, paper became both a tool of order and a shield for disorder. The very system designed to preserve accountability provided new ways to evade it. The emperor might command the truth in red vermilion, but what reached him was always mediated by ink and brush. As the 19th century brought new challenges, foreign invasion, economic strain, technological change, the Qing reliance on paperwork revealed another weakness. While Western powers developed telegraphs, railways, and print-based bureaucracies, the Qing system remained rooted in the slow labor of inkstones and brushes. Reformers within the dynasty urged modernization, but the weight of tradition was immense. The inkstone, once a symbol of refinement and moral discipline, had become a symbol of resistance to change. To abandon it for mechanical printing or telegraphic communication seemed, to conservatives, a betrayal of Confucian values. Thus, the very object that had sustained the dynasty became, in a sense, one of its shackles. For the countless men who lived their lives at the inkstone, the legacy was personal. Some took pride in their calligraphy, in the elegance of their reports, in the knowledge that their words reached the throne. Others felt trapped, worn down by endless copying, their lives consumed by paperwork. The inkstone ground not only ink, but also years of human energy. Each drop of black liquid, a measure of time surrendered to the state. Poems and essays from officials reveal this ambivalence. Some praised the discipline of grinding ink, comparing it to the cultivation of virtue. Others lamented the monotony writing of the inkstone as a prison. "I grind the stone until my spirit is dust," one wrote, "and still the documents multiply." Today, in archives in Beijing and beyond, millions of Qing documents survive. They are brittle, faded, sometimes damaged, but still legible. They remain a treasure trove for historians, offering insight into the daily workings of empire. Through them, we glimpse not only the grand events, but the small petitions of farmers, the careful records of clerks, the annotations of emperors. The inkstones themselves, preserved in museums, remind us of the physical labor behind this paper. empire, worn smooth, some cracked. They testify to centuries of grinding. They are humble objects, yet they carried the empire's weight. The story of the Qing inkstone and its documents is not a tale of triumph or failure alone. It is a story of how ordinary tools, stone, brush, paper can shape the life of a civilization. The empire's strength lay in its capacity to transform life into writing, to bind distant provinces to the throne with paper threads. Its weakness lay in the very abundance of these threads, which tangled into paralysis and obscured reality. And so we are left with a question in our own world, filled with endless documents, files, and data. Are we not also at risk of being buried beneath the very words that sustain us? The image of a Chinese emperor often evokes grandeur, golden robes, dragon motifs, and rituals performed before countless officials. Yet behind the majesty lay something profoundly ordinary. He had to eat, and to feed the Son of Heaven was no simple matter. In the Qing Dynasty, the emperor's daily meals were not a private affair, but an institution, a system of staggering complexity that required entire departments, hundreds of staff, and careful ritual. To understand what it meant to dine as the emperor is to glimpse the machinery of an empire, one bowl of rice at a time. The emperor's food came from the Yushan Fan, literally, the imperial dining room. In reality, this was not a single kitchen, but an entire complex within the Forbidden City. The Yushan was divided into sections, one for main dishes, one for pastries, one for soups, one for drinks. Each had its own specialists, masters of their narrow craft. The scale was immense. Dozens of chefs, assistants, fire tenders, and servers worked daily. Some were Manchu, some Han Chinese, others drawn from regions famous for their cooking traditions. The emperor's table was not simply about nutrition. It was about representing the diversity of the empire. A Manchu emperor might prefer roasted meats in the northern style, but he was also served delicate Jiangnan pastries, Sichuan pickles, and Mongolian dairy products. Even before a dish reached the emperor, it passed through layers of oversight. Ingredients had to be inspected, cooks had to be watched, and tasters had to sample each dish. The emperor's safety depended on these measures. Food was nourishment, but it was also a potential weapon, and so trust was never assumed. Where did the ingredients come from? The answer reveals the reach of the Qing Empire. Rice was brought from Jiangnan, famous for its fertile fields. Fresh fish arrived from southern rivers, sometimes transported live in carefully tended water tanks. Fruits from distant province, lychees from Guangdong, melons from Xinjiang were rushed to the capital in season, packed in ice or wrapped in leaves to preserve freshness. The most prized ingredients often came at great cost. Lychees, for example, could spoil quickly, yet emperors delighted in tasting them. Couriers and officials devised elaborate methods to transport them north, often losing much of the shipment. Along the way, the expense was enormous, but to deny the emperor was unthinkable. Other ingredients came from imperial estates near Beijing. These estates grew vegetables, raised livestock, and supplied milk and meat for the court. The emperor's diet was thus not only a matter of taste, but also an economic system, sustaining entire agricultural operations dedicated to the throne. Meals were governed by ritual. the emperor did not simply sit and eat as he pleased. Instead, dishes were prepared in a fixed order, announced by servers, and placed in front of him in carefully measured portions. The number of dishes could vary, but it was rarely fewer than several dozen, often surpassing 100 for banquets. Yet the emperor rarely consumed much. Reports suggest that he might taste only a few bites from each dish, sampling rather than feasting. The act of eating was less about satisfying hunger and more about demonstrating abundance, balance, and ritual propriety. What mattered was not how much the emperor ate, but that the empire was able to provide. The utensils themselves were symbolic. Chopsticks were often made of jade or ivory, bowls of porcelain, sometimes with gold inlay. Even the placement of utensils followed protocol. Nothing in the imperial meal was accidental. Every detail reinforced hierarchy and order. If the emperor's meals seemed effortless, it was only because countless others labored behind the scenes. Fires had to be lit at just the right moment, water drawn, rice washed, vegetables chopped, sauces prepared. Each action was timed so that the dish would arrive at the emperor's table, hot and fresh. The labor extended beyond the kitchens. Guards stood watch over storerooms. Scribes recorded the menus of each day, creating an archive of meals. Inspectors verified the accounts, ensuring that no ingredients were stolen or misused. Even the waste, the leftovers from the emperor's table, was carefully handled, often distributed to favored eunuchs or servants as a mark of distinction. Thus, a single meal was a performance involving not only cooks but bureaucrats, guards, clerks, and servants. To feed the emperor was to mobilize the empire on a small scale. Because food could be poisoned, safety was a constant concern. Before a dish reached the emperor, tasters sampled it. Even then, the emperor sometimes hesitated. Historical records tell of emperors who favored simple meals, partly out of suspicion, preferring plain dishes of vegetables and rice rather than elaborate banquets. His caution was as much political as personal. This suspicion shaped imperial taste. While the kitchens produced grand banquets for rituals and festivals, daily meals were often simpler than one might expect. To eat like an emperor was not necessarily to eat extravagantly, but to eat with constant awareness that food was never just food, was a matter of survival, authority, and control. The emperor's act of eating carried symbolic weight. When he consumed dishes from different regions, it was more than culinary variety, was a gesture of imperial unity, a reminder that all provinces contributed to the throne. A Manchu emperor who ate Han Chinese dishes or Mongolian dairy was not simply indulging in taste. He was embodying the diversity of his empire. Feasts and banquets further reinforced this symbolism. At grand occasions, when foreign envoys or high officials were present, the abundance of the emperor's table served as a display of wealth and order. The empire could feed its ruler lavishly. Therefore, it could sustain its people, or so the message implied. By the time the emperor set down his jade chopsticks, the work of hundreds had already been spent. Fires extinguished, dishes cleared, leftovers accounted for, records filed, all for a meal that lasted perhaps an hour. It is easy to marvel at this system, but it raises a question. Was the emperor truly nourished? While consuming much labor, Did the endless flow of dishes sustain him as a man, or only as a symbol of empire? If the emperor's daily meals represented the discipline of ritual and the labor of countless servants, then the banquets of the Qing dynasty represented something else entirely: spectacle, politics, and the visible performance of abundance. These were not quiet meals consumed behind palace walls, but elaborate orchestrations that told stories of power, hierarchy, and imperial legitimacy. Through food, the dynasty communicated its wealth, its cultural unity, and its unshakable claim to the mandate of heaven. A Qing imperial banquet was never just a meal. It was theater in which food was both prop and script. Each dish, each course, each flavor played a role. The number of dishes alone conveyed meaning. A minor official's reception might involve a modest spread, but a grand feast for a visiting foreign envoy could easily exceed 100 dishes. The layout was equally deliberate. Dishes were arranged in patterns, often symbolizing cosmological principles: the 5 elements, the 4 directions, the harmony of yin and yang. A banquet was not chaotic excess, but a carefully designed narrative, one that the diners were meant to absorb, even if they did not consciously understand it. The emperor himself was both actor and audience. He tasted sparingly, allowing others to consume more, but his presence sanctified the feast. To sit at the emperor's table, even on its margins, was to be reminded of one's place within the empire's hierarchy. Perhaps the most famous of all Qing banquets was the Manchuhan Imperial Feast, Manhan Chensi, a legendary event said to combine the culinary traditions of the Manchu rulers and their Han Chinese subjects. While historians debate how often such feasts were truly held, records suggest that at least on special occasions, the court did indeed present massive spreads of dishes representing both traditions. This was no simple cultural mixing. It was a political act. By placing Manchu roasted meats and game alongside Han stir-fries and delicate pastries, the feast embodied the idea of a united empire under Qing rule. To eat from both traditions was to participate in harmony, to affirm that Manchu and Han, conqueror and conquered, now shared the same table. Some sources describe hundreds of dishes, ranging from bear paws and deer sinew to shark fin and bird's nest soup. Others mention humble offerings, such as steamed buns or simple greens, included to remind diners that the empire embraced both luxury and simplicity. Whatever the exact details, the point was clear. The emperor's table contained the world. Every dish on the imperial table carried meaning. Fish, pronounced you, was homophonous with the word for surplus and symbolized abundance. Lotus seeds suggested fertility, dumplings wealth, and long noodles longevity. Even the colors of sauces and garnishes were chosen with care, evoking prosperity, harmony, or auspicious seasons. Animal parts, though perhaps unappealing to modern taste, were prized for their symbolic weight. Bear paw represented strength, crane meat, longevity, and exotic ingredients such as leopard fetus or camel hump signaled both rarity and the empire's far reach. Whether or not the emperor enjoyed eating them mattered less than their presence, as tokens of imperial power. Thus, each bite was not only nourishment but a lesson. To dine with the emperor was to partake in a symbolic system as elaborate as any ritual at the altar of heaven. Imperial banquets were also tools of diplomacy. When foreign envoys arrived in Beijing, the emperor's ability to host them at lavish tables demonstrated the wealth and stability of the Qing court. The dishes served were carefully chosen to impress. Shark fin soup to show access to rare seas, bird's nest from distant islands, fruits from the empire's farthest provinces. The act of eating together was itself a negotiation. Envoys who partook acknowledged the emperor's generosity. Those who hesitated risked offending him. In this sense, food became an extension of diplomacy, as binding as treaties or edicts. Some envoys were bewildered by the abundance, unsure which dishes were appropriate to eat. Others recorded their astonishment at the variety of flavors and textures. To them, the emperor's table seemed less like a meal and more like an overwhelming display of resources, reminder that behind the Forbidden City stood a vast empire capable of marshaling its riches at will. But abundance could cut both ways. Within the empire, criticism sometimes arose over the extravagance of imperial feasts. Scholars and officials, steeped in Confucian ideals of frugality, questioned the morality of such displays when common people suffered from famine. Records from the late Qing note instances where officials discreetly urged moderation, reminding emperors that too much excess might undermine the dynasty's image of benevolence. The emperors themselves were aware of this tension. The Kangxi emperor, known for his relative frugality, often preferred simpler meals despite the grand feasts arranged in his honor. His successor, Qianlong, reveled more openly in banquets, using them as a stage to assert imperial magnificence. Thus, the politics of food was not only about external diplomacy, but also internal governance. A feast could project unity and power, but it could also invite criticism if it seemed detached from the hardships of the people. What makes these events particularly vivid today is that they were recorded in detail. Court scribes documented the dishes, the order of serving, and sometimes even the emperor's comments. These records, preserved in archives, allow us to reconstruct the imperial table with remarkable precision. One account describes a banquet with 108 dishes, arranged in 9 groups of 12, symbolizing cosmic completeness. Another describes seasonal feasts where dishes reflected the rhythms of the agricultural year: spring greens, summer melons, autumn game, winter preserved meats. The emperor's table thus mirrored the cycles of the empire, binding human order to natural order. Even paintings depict banquets, with rows of officials seated before endless dishes, musicians playing in the background, and the emperor seated above all, serene and unshakable. These images remind us that a feast was never just food, it was history written in flavor and form. And yet, amid all this symbolism, one must ask, what of the emperor himself? Did he enjoy these feasts? Did he savor the flavors, or was he too constrained by ritual to take pleasure? Some emperors were known for particular tastes. Kangxi favored mutton dishes, reflecting his Manchu heritage. Qianlong enjoyed delicate pastries from Gyeongnan. Yongzheng, wary of excess, ate sparingly. These personal preferences shaped the menus, but only within the rigid structure of ritual. Even the emperor's appetite was subordinated to symbolism. Here lies the paradox. The emperor was the central figure at every feast, yet, in a sense, he was also its prisoner. He could not eat freely as a man, but had to eat as the Son of Heaven, bound by the expectations of his role. Thus, imperial banquets were meals that were never truly about food. They were about the empire's image, the emperor's authority, the unity of cultures, the display of resources. A guest at such a table might taste shark fin or deer sinew, but what he truly consumed was a lesson in power. And yet, this raises a question. If every bite was a symbol, and every feast a performance, was there any space left for genuine nourishment, for the simple pleasure of eating? Or was the emperor's table, for all its abundance, a place where hunger was never truly satisfied? When one imagines the grandeur of Qing imperial dining, it is easy to picture banquets of overwhelming scale, tables crowded with exotic dishes, and rituals that blurred the line between food and performance. But the reality of the emperor's meals was often far quieter, more restrained, and more practical. For every lavish feast meant to impress envoys or dignitaries, there were countless ordinary meals designed not to overwhelm but to sustain. In these quieter moments, the relationship between food and power reveals itself in subtler but no less telling ways. The emperor's daily meals, breakfast, lunch, and supper were prepared with meticulous attention, but were not necessarily excessive. Breakfast might consist of congee, steamed buns, and pickled vegetables. Lunch was typically heartier, with several meat and vegetable dishes, and supper lighter, with soups and seasonal greens. Unlike the sprawling banquets with hundreds of dishes, a regular imperial meal might involve a modest spread of 8 to 12 carefully chosen items. Each dish was small in portion, often no more than a taste or two. This was intentional. Too much food at once could be unhealthy, and wastefulness was frowned upon when it came to the emperor's personal health. Meals were delivered in covered lacquer boxes and arranged on low tables. Each box was labeled, not only with the name of the dish, but also with notes about its ingredients, seasonality, and sometimes even its perceived medicinal properties. The emperor did not simply eat. He was fed according to a system that balanced nourishment, ritual, and medical theory. One striking feature of Qing court dining was the involvement of the imperial physicians. These men, trained in traditional Chinese medicine, oversaw not just the emperor's health in times of illness, but also his daily diet. They believed that food and medicine were intertwined, a concept summed up by the phrase shiliao, meaning food therapy. If the emperor showed signs of fatigue, the menu would shift toward restorative broths. If the seasons changed, so too would the ingredients. Warming foods like lamb in winter, cooling fruits in summer. Even the time of day influenced the selection, guided by theories of yin and yang and the balance of the 5 elements. This medical oversight reflected the belief that the emperor's body was not only his own, but also the body of the state. His health symbolized the empire's well-being. Thus, every grain of rice, every sip of tea, carried political weight as well as nutritional value. Though the emperor could command the rarest delicacies, restraint was often emphasized. Many emperors were careful to avoid indulgence, mindful of Confucian ideals that warned against gluttony. The Kangxi emperor, for example, frequently reminded his sons and courtiers that excess weakened both body and spirit. His own meals, while varied, were relatively modest compared to the banquets staged in his honor. The Yongzheng emperor, known for his ascetic lifestyle, often ate alone, preferring simple dishes like plain porridge. Even the Qianlong emperor, remembered for his enjoyment of southern delicacies, practiced moderation, tasting widely but consuming lightly. This emphasis on moderation was also practical. Too much food posed risks of indigestion or poisoning, both genuine concerns in an age where imperial safety was constantly under threat. Eating lightly was a way of maintaining health, avoiding excess, and ensuring control. Yet, what became of the endless dishes prepared for the emperor each day? Here lies one of the most curious aspects of palace dining. Because food safety was paramount, nor could it be casually discarded, for food associated with the emperor carried symbolic weight. Instead, a system developed for distributing leftovers. Some portions were given to trusted eunuchs, whose loyalty was reinforced by such privileges. Others were redistributed to lower-ranking palace staff. On occasion, surplus food was sent out of the palace to favored officials or even bestowed as rewards, a subtle reminder of imperial generosity. But there were also strict controls. Not every servant could taste imperial leftovers, and records were kept to prevent abuse. Even waste had to be managed within the structure of palace hierarchy. A bowl of rice, once placed before the emperor, carried traces of power even if he never lifted his chopsticks to it. The kitchens of the Forbidden City were a microcosm of the Qing Dynasty itself. Their scale reflected the empire's vastness, their rituals mirrored its hierarchy, and their constant activity echoed the endless cycle of governance. In the kitchens, one found both abundance and discipline. Exotic ingredients arrived from the farthest provinces, carried by caravans and tribute missions, while cooks worked according to rigid schedules. Here, fish from Guangdong, lamb from Inner Mongolia, rice from the south, and fruits from the northwest all came together, just as the empire itself was bound together by diverse peoples and lands. The kitchens thus embodied the empire's claim to universality. The emperor ate the foods of every region, symbolically uniting them within his body. His table was not merely his own, it was a miniature version of the empire itself for all. This abundance and symbolism, one cannot ignore the solitude of imperial dining. The emperor often ate alone, attended by eunuchs, but not joined by family or ministers. Unlike the warmth of a household meal, imperial dining was ritualized, structured, and controlled. This solitude underscored the unique position of the emperor. He was the center of the empire, yet set apart from it. His meals reflected this paradox, deeply connected to the lives of millions, yet consumed in quiet isolation behind palace walls. The act of eating, so ordinary for most people, was for the emperor an event layered with meaning, watched and recorded, bounded by rules. Every bite affirmed his role, but perhaps it also reminded him of his distance from ordinary life. As the Qing dynasty entered its final century, the rituals of imperial dining continued, but cracks began to appear. Foreign pressures strained the empire's resources. Famines swept provinces, even as palace banquets remained lavish. Critics grew louder, noting the contradiction between the suffering countryside and the excesses of the court. By the time of the last Qing emperors, the grandeur of imperial dining seemed almost an echo of the past. The Xuantong emperor, better known as Puyi, recalled in his memoirs that as a child he was overwhelmed by the elaborate meals set before him, yet he ate little, distracted by the isolation of palace life. His meals, he admitted, were often cold by the time he touched them. In this way, the emperor's table became a symbol not only of imperial power, but also of its decline. The rituals continued, but their meaning frayed. The empire itself was slipping away, even as the kitchens of the Forbidden City carried on with their ancient routines. In the end, the story of Qing imperial dining is not merely about food. It is about how daily life, ritual, and survival intertwine with the machinery of empire. Meals sustained the emperor, but they also sustained the illusion of unshakable order. Kitchens became archives of power, leftovers, tokens of hierarchy, and even plain bowls of rice, instruments of governance. And yet, one wonders, in the quiet moments when the emperor lifted his chopsticks, tasting a simple dumpling, or sipping a bowl of congee, did he ever set aside the weight of symbolism? Did he ever eat not as the Son of Heaven, but simply as a man hungry, tired, seeking nourishment? It is a question history cannot answer, yet one that lingers at the empty tables of the Forbidden City, where silence now echoes in the place of imperial banquets. When the Qing Dynasty reigned from its seat in the Forbidden City, all eyes were naturally fixed on emperors, empresses, and grand officials. Their names filled records, their portraits adorned scrolls, and their decisions shaped the lives of millions. Yet, behind every act of imperial ritual, every grand banquet, and every daily routine of the court, stood an invisible network of men and women who carried the weight of service. These were the servants of the Qing palace, eunuchs, maids, and minor attendants who worked in silence, bound by obedience and discipline. To understand the lives of these servants is to peer into the quiet machinery that kept the palace alive. Their stories rarely appear in official histories, yet their presence touched every chamber, every hallway, and every moment of daily life within the Forbidden City. The palace was not maintained by a handful of helpers, but by a vast workforce, carefully organized into ranks and divisions. At the top of the servant hierarchy were the eunuchs, men who had sacrificed their bodies for the chance to serve. They held authority in certain domains, particularly in the handling of the emperor's daily needs and in the guarding of inner secrets. Alongside them worked the gonyu, or palace maids, young women brought into the Forbidden City from noble or bannerman families. Their service was often temporary, 3 years, 6 years, or sometimes longer, after which they were dismissed, married off, or reassigned. Beneath them were the lowest attendants, menial workers who cleaned floors, carried water, or tended fires. Together, these groups formed a living hierarchy of obedience. Each servant answered to another, and their duties were precisely defined, down to the smallest detail. It was a world where status determined not only one's tasks, but also how close one might ever come to the emperor's presence. Entry into palace service was never random. For eunuchs, the path was harsh. Many were children of poor families, offered or sold into service. Castration was performed to ensure their suitability, and once they entered the palace, their lives were forever bound to the dynasty. A eunuch could rise to great power, controlling keys to storerooms, overseeing correspondence, even whispering advice in the emperor's ear. But he could also be condemned to anonymity, laboring for decades in kitchens or storerooms without recognition. For palace maids, the process was more formal. Every 3 years, bannerman families in Beijing and the surrounding provinces were required to provide young women for selection. They would be brought to the palace, examined for health and appearance, and assigned roles according to the needs of the court. Some became attendants in the empress's household. Others tended to the emperor's clothing, while many were relegated to cleaning and laundry. This system ensured a constant supply of obedient labor. Yet, behind the official structure lay countless human stories of separation from families, of lifelong service, and of identities reshaped by the demands of palace life. A servant's day began before sunrise. The Forbidden City woke not with the emperor, but with the rustle of servants preparing for the day ahead. Fires had to be stoked, hot water carried to bathing chambers, incense lit in shrines, and clothing prepared for the emperor's morning audiences. Every task was performed quietly, for noise was considered disruptive to the solemnity of court life. Palace maids rotated through cycles of labor, sewing robes, cleaning halls, polishing lacquered furniture, and attending to the empress and consorts. Eunuchs were tasked with guarding entrances, delivering messages, or managing storerooms of food, wine, and precious objects. Minor attendants swept courtyards, cleared snow, and ensured that lanterns were lit at night. Service was relentless. There were no weekends, no breaks, only the rhythm of the court calendar, dictated by ceremonies, feasts, and rituals. Even illness was no excuse. Substitutes were rare, and duties had to be carried out, regardless of personal hardship. The obedience of servants was reinforced by strict codes of conduct. Speech was regulated. Servants could not address the emperor directly unless spoken to. Eye contact was limited. It was often forbidden to look at the emperor's face. Every gesture was prescribed, from the way one bowed to the manner of presenting an object. Punishments for disobedience could be severe. A careless word, a broken item, or even a misplaced step in the wrong hallway could result in beatings, dismissal, or worse. For eunuchs, the stakes were especially high, as their entire existence depended on imperial favor. And yet, within these rigid structures, there was also pride. Many servants saw themselves as essential to the functioning of the empire. Their discipline and invisibility were their strengths. To move silently, to obey without question, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. These were marks of excellence. Life for servants was not lived in the grand halls of the Forbidden City, but in hidden quarters, tucked behind walls and corridors. Palace maids often slept in shared dormitories, their lives governed by bells that marked the hours of labor and rest. Eunuchs occupied cramped rooms near the spaces they served, sometimes barely large enough for a bedroll. Meals for servants were simple, consisting of rice, vegetables, and occasionally scraps of meat from palace kitchens. Their clothing was plain compared to the silks worn by nobles' cotton robes, marked by rank and function. These garments themselves symbolized hierarchy. Some permitted certain colors, others confined to dull hues. The palace was a gilded world for emperors, but for servants, it was a place of confinement. Few could leave, fewer still could return to ordinary life. Their world was measured in corridors, gates, and courtyards, and empire within an empire, bounded by walls of red and gold. Amid this rigid discipline, moments of humanity persisted. A palace maid might secretly comfort another when homesickness became too heavy. Eunuchs developed lifelong friendships, sharing both burdens and small joys. Stories tell of servants who planted flowers in hidden corners, creating small gardens unseen by their masters, or who sang quietly to themselves while scrubbing endless floors. Such acts did not change their duties, but they offered glimpses of life beyond obedience. They remind us that even within the most rigid systems, human resilience finds a way to endure. The servants of the Qing court were not the ones who signed decrees or commanded armies, yet without their quiet labor, the palace would have ceased to function. They are the invisible hands of history, the threads that bound the fabric of court life together. And yet, their lives raise questions. What did obedience mean in a world where personal will was suppressed? Was it loyalty, survival, or simply the inevitability of circumstance? These questions linger unresolved as we step deeper into the lives of these servants in Section 2, where we will explore how obedience shaped not only their labor, but their identities, relationships, and sense of belonging. The daily rhythm of the Qing palace demanded constant labor from its servants. But beyond their tasks and rules of conduct lays something deeper, the way obedience reshaped their very identities. To serve in the Forbidden City was not merely to carry out duties. It was to live in a world where personal will was subdued, molded, and in some cases erased by the requirements of the dynasty. In this section, we turn from the routines of work to the lived experiences of obedience, how it defined relationships, created communities, and left lasting marks on those who served. Obedience in the Qing palace was not only about following orders, it was a culture instilled from the moment a servant entered through the palace gates. Every gesture, bowing, kneeling, speaking, even standing, was framed by a code of submission. In this environment, one learned quickly that individuality was dangerous. To question, to hesitate, to act out of personal inclination risked punishment or disgrace. For eunuchs, obedience meant total devotion to the emperor and his household. They were taught to see themselves not as individuals, but as extensions of the ruler's will. Palace maids, meanwhile, were bound to the empress or consorts, their lives structured around anticipating needs and responding instantly. Even minor attendants, whose tasks might involve little more than carrying water or sweeping floors, were expected to perform with silent discipline. This obedience was not always born of respect or loyalty. More often, it was a necessity. To survive in the palace, one obeyed without question. The weight of hierarchy left no space for negotiation. Obedience was not assumed, it was cultivated. New servants underwent periods of strict training. They were instructed in the proper ways to walk slow, measured, without excessive noise. They learned how to address superiors, when to kneel, and how to handle objects with care. Mistakes were corrected with severity. A dropped plate might result in public scolding. Through repetition and fear, obedience became second nature. Over time, servants no longer needed to be told. They anticipated, adjusted, and performed their roles instinctively. This training had a psychological. Obedience became part of identity, a reflex as natural as breathing. Yet within this framework of control, servants formed bonds with one another. These relationships were often born from shared hardship. Eunuchs, in particular, developed tight-knit communities. Living together in cramped quarters, they shared food, whispered stories, and offered protection against the harshness of superiors. Palace maids also formed small circles of companionship. Older maids guided younger ones, teaching them survival strategies. They exchanged knowledge about which consorts were harsh and which were merciful, about when to speak and when to remain silent. These bonds were rarely equal. Hierarchies existed even among servants, with senior eunuchs or headmaids exercising authority over others. But within these structures, friendship could soften the weight of obedience. A kind word, a shared secret, or a small act of generosity offered respite from the rigidity of palace life. While obedience could be suffocating, it also created opportunities for advancement. For eunuchs especially, loyalty and diligence were rewarded. A eunuch who proved trustworthy might rise from menial tasks to positions of storerooms, overseeing finances, or even serving as close attendants to the emperor himself. Such advancement was rare, but it offered a path to power unimaginable outside the palace. The careers of figures like Li Lianying, the favored eunuch of Empress Dowager Cixi, illustrate how obedience, coupled with shrewdness, could transform a servant into a power broker. Yet such cases were exceptions, and the majority remained anonymous. Their obedience recognized only within the narrow confines of palace life. For palace maids, advancement was more limited, while a few were promoted. To serve directly under the empress or higher consorts, most completed their years of service and were dismissed. Many servants lived with a profound sense of isolation. Palace maids often entered the forbidden city in their early teens, separated from families, and spent years cut off from the outside world. Their only reality became the routines of service and the relationships forged with fellow maids. Eunuchs, meanwhile, bore the added burden of physical sacrifice. Many lived with health complications, pain, and the stigma of being neither fully accepted as men nor integrated into ordinary society. Their obedience was not only demanded, but often internalized as the only path to dignity within their constrained lives. Personal desires, whether for love, freedom, or self-expression, continually suppressed. Some found outlets in writing poetry, practicing calligraphy, or cultivating small gardens in hidden corners of the palace. Others channeled their emotions into loyalty, convincing themselves that service to the dynasty was a noble calling. Despite years of service, a servant's position remained fragile. A single mistake could undo decades of obedience. Eunuchs who offended the wrong superior could be beaten, dismissed, or even executed. Damaging property or engaging in forbidden relationships could face dismissal or disgrace. This fragility reinforced the culture of obedience. Every action mattered, every word carried weight. The palace was a place where survival depended not only on diligence, but on constant vigilance. Yet obedience was never absolute. Beneath the surface, acts of quiet defiance existed. Some servants developed subtle ways of resisting. A eunuch might delay carrying out an order he considered unjust, disguising the delay as accident. A palace maid might feign illness to avoid a particularly harsh consort. Minor attendants sometimes exchanged gossip or smuggled small goods to ease their lives. These acts were rarely overt. open rebellion was unthinkable, but they revealed the limits of obedience. Even in the most controlled environment, human beings sought moments of autonomy, however small. In the Qing palace, obedience was more than behavior, it was a way of life. It shaped identities, determined fates, and bound servants to a system larger than themselves. Yet within this obedience, traces of humanity remained, friendships, ambitions, and even small rebellions. The lives of these servants force us to ask, can obedience ever fully erase individuality? Or does the human spirit always find ways, however subtle, to assert itself, even in the shadow of an emperor's will? This question lingers as we move into Section 3, where we will consider the long-term legacy of these servants. What became of them after years of service? How did their obedience shape not only their lives, but the history of the Qing Dynasty itself? The Qing Dynasty could not have functioned without the tireless service of its palace attendants. Their obedience sustained the daily operations of the Forbidden City, ensuring that rituals, meals, ceremonies, and governance proceeded with unbroken continuity. Yet the legacy of these servants extends beyond their daily duties. When we consider their long years of submission, what remains is not only the story of control, but also the quiet impact they left on Chinese history and culture. For palace maids, service was typically temporary. After years in the Forbidden City, often from adolescence into early adulthood, they were dismissed. Some were married off to bannerman soldiers or lower-ranking officials. The court arranged these marriages carefully, both to reward loyalty and to ensure that former maids did not carry dangerous secrets outside the palace walls. For these women, obedience did not end with dismissal. Having lived for years under rigid hierarchy, they often carried palace habits into their married lives, speaking softly, anticipating needs, and suppressing personal desires. Husbands sometimes admired their refinement, while others saw them as distant, molded by years of servitude into something less than fully ordinary. Eunuchs faced a more complex fate. Many remained in the palace until death, for they had no families to return to and little place in the outside world. A few who accumulated wealth during their service retired and built homes, but they were exceptions. The majority lived and died within the palace walls, their obedience rewarded only with modest stipends and small burial grounds outside Beijing. Even in death, the legacy of palace service persisted. Burial records show that eunuchs were often interred in communal cemeteries, far from the ancestral graves that defined traditional Chinese identity. Their lives of obedience were thus mirrored in their afterlives, collective, anonymous, subsumed into service. Palace maids, by contrast, left descendants who sometimes recalled with pride that their grandmother or great-grandmother had once served in the Forbidden City. This memory conferred a kind of status, though it also carried the unspoken acknowledgement that their ancestors' youth had been spent in a world of constraint. In literature and folklore, eunuchs were remembered with ambivalence. Some were praised for loyalty, others condemned as schemers. Yet, even in negative portrayals, their image was tied to obedience. They were remembered not as free agents, but as figures defined by service to power. Though silent in official histories, servants shaped the culture of the court in countless ways. Eunuchs managed the logistics of palace life, ensuring that rituals proceeded flawlessly. Palace maids maintained the refined atmosphere of the women's quarters, preserving traditions of etiquette, dress, and comportment. They also left subtle cultural imprints. Many eunuchs, for instance, were skilled in calligraphy or theater, and they brought these arts into the palace. Some became patrons of opera troupes or copied Buddhist sutras in their spare time. Palace maids embroidered garments, producing works of textile art that reflected both their training and their creativity. These contributions were often unsigned, unacknowledged, but they formed part of the living culture of the dynasty. Without them, the refinement of Qing court life would not have been possible. It may seem paradoxical, but obedience itself became a form of power. The dynasty relied so completely on servants' compliance that their silent labor shaped the very functioning of the empire. The emperor could hold court only because eunuchs arranged the hall. The empress could appear regal only because maids prepared her attire. Every gesture of imperial grandeur rested upon countless acts of obedience performed in the shadows. Yet this power was never recognized. It was structural, not personal. The servants themselves had little voice in history, but their obedience was the foundation upon which history was built. What can we learn from lives so bound by submission? On one level, these stories remind us of the resilience of human beings. Even in environments of extreme control, servants found ways to live through friendships, small acts of defiance, or the cultivation of skills. On another level, they caution us about the costs of obedience. To maintain the grandeur of an empire, thousands of lives were bent, narrowed, and in some cases erased. The Qing Dynasty fell in 1911, but its legacy of obedience lingered. In popular imagination, eunuchs came to symbolize the decadence and decline of the court, while palace maids were remembered as emblems of quiet endurance. Their lives, once hidden behind palace walls, became part of the story of China's transformation from empire to republic. The servants of the Qing court lived lives carved in silence. They rarely spoke in the records, and when they did, it was often through the filter of official reports or later memoirs. Yet their presence shaped everything: the emperor's meals, the empress's rituals, the ceremonies of state. Their obedience built an empire of continuity and discipline. But it also raises a lingering question: when history depends so heavily on those who remain invisible, how much of our past is shaped by silence rather than voice? The Forbidden City was not simply an imperial residence. It was a landscape of deliberate design, where even the placement of a rock or the curve of a pathway held meaning. Within its vast walls stretched gardens, courtyards, and ritual spaces that reflected not personal whim, but the order of empire. To step into these gardens was to enter a world shaped by hierarchy, symbolism, and control. The first impression of the Forbidden City is its austerity. Red walls rise high, cutting the palace off from the life of Beijing. Beyond the gates, however, spaces of controlled beauty unfold. Gardens softened the rigidity of stone halls, offering the emperor and his household glimpses of nature, carefully arranged to reflect harmony and authority. Unlike private gardens in Suzhou or Yangzhou designed for wandering, for poetry, and for moments of playful surprise, the palace gardens served political and ritual functions. They were spaces where nature was disciplined, much like the servants and officials who moved through them. At the northern end of the Forbidden City lies the most famous of these spaces, the Imperial Garden, or Uioan. Established in the early 15th century, it covered just over 12,000 square meters, a modest size compared to the vastness of the palace, but rich in symbolism. Here, cypress and pine trees stood alongside ancient scholar rocks. Pathways were laid out in deliberate symmetry, leading from one pavilion to another. The emperor and empress used this garden not for leisurely strolls, but for ritual appearances, festivals, and carefully prescribed forms of recreation. The placement of structures within the garden reinforced hierarchy. Pavilions bore names like Pavilion of 10,000 Autumns or Pavilion of Imperial Peace, projecting longevity and stability. Even the smallest decorative choices, the design of roof tiles, the colors of painted beams were imbued with meaning. Every element in the garden served a purpose beyond aesthetics. Cypress trees symbolized endurance, standing tall through centuries. Rocks, imported from distant provinces, represented mountains, anchoring the dynasty to the natural order. Flower beds rotated with the seasons, ensuring that blossoms matched the ritual calendar. This was not nature for its own sake. It was a reflection of cosmic order, an earthly echo of heaven's mandate. The emperor's ability to control and arrange the natural world was a metaphor for his ability to control and arrange his empire. The gardens were not open spaces for all who lived in the palace. Access was carefully restricted. The emperor and empress enjoyed the most freedom, while consorts, princes, and princesses used the gardens under strict rules. Palace maids and eunuchs entered only when required for duties, carrying tea, sweeping paths, arranging lanterns for festivals. Thus, the gardens themselves mirrored the social structure of the palace. Just as servants obeyed orders, so too did flowers bloom on command, and rocks sit immovable where placed. Nature became another tool of hierarchy, reinforcing the power of the throne. The gardens also served as stages for ritual. On certain festivals, the imperial family gathered under pavilions to mark the passing of seasons. During the Double Ninth Festival in autumn, chrysanthemum displays lined the walkways, symbolizing longevity. At New Year, pine and bamboo were emphasized, echoing themes of resilience and renewal. Even private moments carried ritual weight. The emperor might summon trusted officials to walk with him among the cypresses, but such strolls were not informal. They were acts of calculated symbolism, reminders of imperial favor and control. To appreciate the uniqueness of the palace gardens, one must compare them with the famed gardens of Zhengnan literati. In Suzhou, for instance, gardens were designed for wandering scholars, filled with winding paths, hidden corners, and sudden vistas. Their purpose was reflection, inspiration, and retreat from official duties. The Forbidden City's gardens, by contrast, resisted surprise. Their symmetry discouraged wandering without purpose. Their pavilions were not retreats, but stages. Where the scholar garden encouraged individuality, the palace garden enforced collectivity. One reflected personal taste, the other imperial order. For the emperor, the gardens were more than pleasant retreats. They were reminders of his role as mediator between heaven and earth. By tending, viewing, or even walking through these spaces, he symbolically aligned himself with the rhythms of the cosmos. Yet one wonders, Did emperors ever look upon these carefully arranged gardens and long for wildness? Did they ever wish to walk freely, unobserved, through untamed landscapes? Or did the weight of ritual make even beauty feel like another form of confinement? The gardens of the Forbidden City remind us that beauty can also serve power. Every tree, stone, and pavilion was arranged to reinforce the emperor's authority. Yet within these controlled landscapes lay quiet questions about freedom, order, and the cost of perfection. As we move to Section 2, we will explore how the daily use of these gardens revealed the tension between ritual purpose and personal experience. How did emperors, empresses, and servants navigate spaces that were at once serene and suffocating? The imperial garden and other ritual spaces of the Forbidden City may appear timeless and serene, but they were not static displays. They were lived-in environments, inhabited by emperors, empresses, consorts, eunuchs, and servants who moved through them every day. Yet daily life in these spaces was never casual. Every step, every use of the garden carried meaning, whether as an act of obedience, a display of favor, or a ritual in miniature. For the emperor, mornings often began with audiences in the great halls, surrounded by ministers and memorials. But on certain days, before or after such duties, he would stroll into the gardens. These walks were not spontaneous. Attendants prepared the pathways, swept fallen leaves, and positioned guards to ensure security. The emperor rarely walked alone. Eunuchs trailed behind at respectful distances, carrying writing brushes, tea, or even cloaks in case of sudden weather changes. If the emperor paused to observe a tree in bloom or a scholar's rock, the act itself could be interpreted as symbolic. His preference for a certain blossom could set trends in the wider empire. Even a moment of silence before a cypress tree might be read as an omen of resilience or longevity. Thus, what might seem like an ordinary stroll in a garden was, in truth, a ritual of governance. The emperor's every gesture carried the weight of interpretation. While the emperor symbolized cosmic authority, the empress embodied stability within the inner court. Her use of the gardens reflected this role. She presided over seasonal festivals, leading the women of the palace in carefully arranged gatherings. For example, during the Mid-Autumn festival, the empress and her attendants might gather under a pavilion to admire the full moon. Lanterns were hung, poems recited, and offerings made. Yet even in these seemingly joyful moments, strict protocols dictated who sat where, who served tea, and who had the right to speak. Imperial consorts, meanwhile, experienced the gardens differently. Their access was often mediated by rank. A favored concubine might be granted permission to walk with the emperor, her presence in the garden signaling her influence. Others could only admire the garden from behind latticed windows, their isolation emphasized by the very beauty they were denied. Eunuchs were the unseen machinery of the garden. They tended to lanterns, trimmed trees, swept pathways, and arranged seasonal displays. During festivals, they managed the logistics of transporting flowers and decorative screens. In winter, they scattered ash and sand to keep paths from becoming dangerously icy. For eunuchs, gardens were workplaces rather than retreats. Yet many developed deep knowledge of plants, weather, and seasonal rhythms. Some became adept at cultivating chrysanthemums or pruning pines. Their skills quietly shaping the garden's appearance. These men, whose bodies had been reshaped by service, found in gardening a form of expertise that, while uncelebrated, was indispensable. In the margins of imperial life, they became silent custodians of beauty. Palace maids experienced the gardens differently again. They were summoned to carry trays of food or prepare tea during outdoor rituals. On festival days, they decorated pavilions with silk hangings or polished jade vessels. Their role was to disappear into the background, ensuring the smooth flow of ceremonies without ever intruding. Yet for some maids, the gardens offered fleeting moments of respite. A pause while carrying a tray might allow a glance at blossoms in spring or the bright leaves of autumn. In memoirs of former palace women, such stolen glimpses of beauty are recalled as rare treasures amid lives otherwise confined to obedience. The gardens reached their peak significance during annual festivals. Seasonal cycles dictated both planting and ritual. Spring, peonies, and magnolias were emphasized, symbolizing renewal and prosperity. The emperor might host banquets beneath flowering trees, reinforcing the theme of abundance. Summer, lotus blossoms, filled basins and ponds, evoking purity and resilience. Court painters captured these scenes, turning the gardens into images of moral order. Autumn chrysanthemums dominated, linked to longevity and the double ninth festival. Displays of hundreds of cultivated varieties reflected not only beauty, but the empire's ability to command nature. Winter, pines, bamboo, and plum blossoms stood as the three friends of winter, representing endurance under hardship. Their presence reminded all who entered the garden of the dynasty's claim to permanence. For the court, these displays were not decorative, but didactic. They reinforced lessons of loyalty, endurance, and harmony values that underpinned the empire's ideology. Yet even in this world of order, tensions arose. Servants occasionally damaged rare plants or misplaced decorative stones, provoking anger from superiors. A eunuch who failed to maintain a chrysanthemum display might be demoted or beaten. Gardens were symbols of control, and any disruption, whether wilting flowers or fallen debris, was interpreted as disorder. For the imperial family, gardens could also become sites of rivalry. A favored concubine's walk with the emperor in the garden might stir jealousy among others. The seemingly serene spaces thus concealed quiet competitions, where access to beauty was also access to power. Daily life in the Forbidden City's gardens reflected the broader reality of Qing governance. Just as paths were swept smooth, so too was the empire expected to remain orderly. Just as flowers bloomed according to the calendar, so too were officials expected to act in accordance with ritual. The gardens were not escape, but mirror. They embodied the ideals of harmony and control that sustained the dynasty, reminding all who entered them of their place within a carefully ordered universe. The imperial garden may appear to modern eyes as a place of peace, but for those who lived and worked within its confines, it was a theater of duty. Every act within it, from an emperor's pause before a pine tree to a eunuch's trimming of branches, reinforced a system of hierarchy. And yet, within this structure, people still found moments of private meaning. A maid's secret admiration of blossoms, a eunuch's pride in his cultivated chrysanthemums, perhaps even an emperor's unspoken yearning for untamed landscapes. As we turn to Section 3, we must ask, what was the long-term legacy of these ritual landscapes? When the dynasty fell, did these gardens retain their power, or did they become relics of a vanished order? By the late Qing Dynasty, the Forbidden City's gardens remained outwardly unchanged. Cypress and pine still stood sentinel, scholar rocks still towered in symbolic authority, and pavilions bore their auspicious names. Yet the world around them shifted. Foreign incursions, internal rebellions, and the erosion of imperial power transformed the meaning of these ritual spaces. What had once been symbols of eternal stability became reminders of fragility, and eventually relics of a vanished order. During the 19th century, emperors like Daoguang and Shanfeng presided over a dynasty increasingly beset by crises. The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and foreign demands shook the empire's foundations. Within the walls of the Forbidden City, however, the gardens maintained their rigid rituals. Seasonal festivals continued. Chrysanthemums still lined the walkways in autumn, and eunuchs still swept the paths. Yet a sense of strain grew. The emperor's presence in the garden no longer conveyed unshakable authority, but instead a performance meant to conceal weakness. The very order of the gardens began to feel like denial, a mask covering cracks in the empire's foundations. As turmoil intensified, emperors increasingly retreated to the summer palace, a larger and more naturalistic landscape northwest of Beijing. There, lakes, hills, and extended gardens offered a more expansive setting compared to the rigid symmetry of the Forbidden City's gardens. The summer palace reflected a different mode of imperial retreat, less ritualistic, more indulgent. Yet even in escape, the shadow of ritual followed. Ceremonies were staged, officials summoned, and gardens maintained as symbols of order. Still, the growing preference for the summer palace suggested that the Forbidden City's gardens were losing their central importance. They became not the core of empire, but a backdrop for a court increasingly out of touch with its responsibilities. Few figures illustrate this transformation better than Empress Dowager Cixi. Though she often resided at the summer palace, her occasional presence in the Forbidden City's gardens carried enormous weight. She staged elaborate festivals, using the ordered beauty of the gardens to project an image of control. Cixi was acutely aware of the symbolic power of ritual spaces. When she appeared beneath pavilions or admired seasonal displays, courtiers recorded her gestures with meticulous detail. Yet beneath the surface, her reliance on gardens as stages for authority highlighted the growing theatricality of Qing rule. Power became performance, and gardens became the set. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, the Forbidden City's gardens underwent a profound shift. No longer stages of imperial ritual, they became empty spaces, stripped of their original function. Trees still bloomed, but no emperor paused to contemplate them. Pavilions still stood, but no empress hosted seasonal gatherings beneath their roofs. For a time, the last emperor Pui remained in the Forbidden City under the Articles of Favorable Treatment. As a child, he played within the gardens, riding his bicycle along the pathways once reserved for solemn rituals. The very spaces that had symbolized hierarchy became playgrounds, their original meaning fading into memory. When Py was expelled in 1924, the gardens entered a new chapter. They became museum grounds, objects of public viewing rather than imperial control. Visitors walked freely where once only emperors and empresses had strolled. The symbolism of hierarchy dissolved into the neutrality of heritage. As the Forbidden City transformed into the Palace Museum, its gardens were reformed. No longer symbols of living authority, they became historical exhibits. Guidebooks described the symbolism of rocks and pines, the meanings of pavilions, the cycles of seasonal flowers. What had once been lived ritual became text, plaque, and explanation. Visitors admired the gardens for their beauty, but also for their strangeness. The symmetry, once oppressive, now appeared tranquil. The pavilions, once stages for power, became picturesque relics for photographs. Nature, once disciplined to serve imperial order, now simply offered calm to mute. The transformation raises a paradox. Were the gardens truly liberated by the end of empire? Or did they lose their power entirely once stripped of ritual? Looking beyond Beijing, the Forbidden City's gardens can be compared to ritual landscapes. In other cultures, the gardens of Versailles, for instance, also symbolized absolute authority. Louis XIV's symmetrical avenues projected control over nature and people alike. When monarchy fell in France, Versailles too became a museum, its gardens admired more for beauty than power. Similarly, Japanese imperial gardens, once reserved for the emperor, eventually opened to the public, their symbolism shifting from exclusivity to cultural heritage. Across cultures, gardens once used to stage authority have tended to survive, but in altered form, as spaces of memory rather than control. Today, the imperial garden of the Forbidden City still follows seasonal cycles. Peonies bloom in spring, chrysanthemums in autumn, pines endure through winter. Yet their meaning has changed. They no longer symbolize the emperor's mandate, but instead stand as fragments of history. For visitors, walking these paths can provoke reflection. What does it mean to admire beauty that once embodied hierarchy? Can we separate the aesthetic from the political? Or does every glimpse of a scholar's rock remind us that nature itself was once pressed into service of authority? The gardens persist, not as eternal symbols of order, but as reminders of the fragility of power. Their symmetry, once proclaimed stability, now it whispers of impermanence. The gardens of the Forbidden City embody a strange duality. They were both beautiful and suffocating, serene and symbolic, natural and artificial. For centuries, they reminded all who entered them of hierarchy, ritual, and cosmic order. When the dynasty fell, their meaning shifted but did not vanish. Today, they invite us to walk slowly, to contemplate the tension between order and freedom, between beauty and control. They stand as evidence that even the most boring details of daily life-swept paths, trimmed trees, arranged flowers can reveal profound truths about human history. Perhaps the most lingering question is this: when we walk through these gardens now, are we visitors in a museum, or are we unwittingly still participants in a ritual of order that has not entirely disappeared?